There is a particular kind of financial pain that nobody talks about because from the outside, it doesn't look like pain at all. It looks like success. It looks like a decent car in the driveway, a reasonable apartment, a salary that clears 4 figures every 2 weeks, and a life that, by most visible measures, appears to be working. But underneath that surface, something quiet and deeply uncomfortable is happening. The money comes in and the money goes out. And no matter how many months pass, the number in the account stays roughly the same. Not because the person is irresponsible, not because they're spending on luxury, but because the system they're inside of is specifically designed to absorb every dollar they earn. This is what economists and behavioral researchers sometimes call the middle-class trap, and it is not a moral failing or a personal flaw. It is a structural phenomenon, one that has been quietly expanding for decades, pulling more people into its orbit with each passing year, while the visible markers of being caught inside it look almost identical to the visible markers of doing well. To understand how it works, you first have to understand what income actually is versus what people assume it to be. Most people treat income as wealth. They treat a higher salary as financial progress, and in the most immediate sense, it feels that way. More money coming in should mean more money accumulating, and yet for tens of millions of households, that's not what happens. What happens instead is something researchers call expenditure creep, the slow, largely unconscious expansion of spending that follows any expansion of income until the gap between what comes in and what goes out returns to approximately where it started. The mechanism is partly psychological and partly structural. On the psychological side, human beings are deeply wired for social comparison, and the reference group that shapes our spending expectations tends to be the people just slightly above us, the neighbors, the colleagues, the curated lives visible through every screen we look at. When income rises, the lifestyle that felt aspirational begins to feel attainable, and then normal, and then necessary. The apartment that was fine becomes too small. The car that worked becomes embarrassing. The vacations, the restaurants, the clothing, all of it quietly ratchets upward in response to the income, and the ratchet almost never moves backward. But the structural side is equally important, and in many ways more insidious, because it operates whether or not you're paying attention. The middle income range, roughly the band between $45,000 and $120,000 in the United States, depending on geography, sits in a specific and deeply uncomfortable position relative to the tax code, the housing market, and the financial products that are marketed to people at that income level. It's a range where you earn too much to qualify for most assistance programs, but not enough to absorb major financial shocks without going into debt. It's a range where the marginal tax rates are high enough to meaningfully reduce take-home pay, but not high enough to generate the kind of tax planning conversations that wealthy households have with advisors. And it's a range where the financial industry has designed an enormous number of products specifically calibrated to capture the money that flows through it. Consider the mortgage. For decades, home ownership has been framed as the central wealth-building mechanism available to the middle class, the one asset that working people could accumulate, appreciate, and eventually pass down. And there is real truth in that framing. But there is also a layer beneath it that rarely gets discussed. A 30-year fixed mortgage on a median-priced home means that for the first decade of payments, the overwhelming majority of each monthly payment goes toward interest, not equity. A household buying a $350,000 home with a conventional loan will pay somewhere in the range of $250,000 in interest over the life of the loan money that builds no asset, creates no equity, and generates no return. The math is not secret, it's disclosed in every mortgage document, but it is structured in a way that makes it nearly invisible at the monthly level, where the payment simply feels like the cost of having a home. The same logic applies to automobile financing, to revolving credit card debt, and to the entire ecosystem of deferred payment products that have become normalized inside middle-income life. Each individual product, looked at in isolation, seems manageable. But when you map out the total interest burden carried by a median household, mortgage interest, car loan interest, credit card interest, student loan interest, you begin to see that a significant portion of that household's income is not being used to build anything. It is being used to service the cost of having borrowed money in the past, which is an entirely different. This is where the trap becomes self-reinforcing. Debt service consumes the margin that would otherwise be available for saving and investing. Without savings, the household has no buffer against unexpected expenses, which means that when those expenses arrive and they always do the response is to borrow again, adding another layer of debt service to the monthly burden, compressing the margin further, and making the next unexpected expense even more destabilizing than the last. Researchers who study household financial fragility have found that a majority of American households cannot absorb a $1,000 emergency expense without borrowing or selling something. That is not a statistic about poverty. That is a statistic about people with jobs, with salaries, with cars and homes, and the full external appearance of financial stability. What makes this particularly difficult to see from the inside is that each individual decision within the system feels rational because it is rational, given the constraints in which it's made. Financing a car makes sense when you need transportation and don't have $20,000 in cash. Carrying a credit card balance makes sense when the alternative is not paying a bill. Taking on a 30-year mortgage makes sense when the alternative is renting indefinitely in a rising market. The trap is not built from irrational choices. It's built from rational choices made inside a system that offers very few genuinely good options to people at this income level, while consistently extracting value from the options that are available. The historical dimension of this is worth understanding, because the middle-class trap is not simply a permanent feature of economic life. It is a relatively recent intensification of structural pressures that have been building since the early 1980s. In the 3 decades following World War II, productivity growth and wage growth moved roughly in parallel. When the economy became more efficient, workers at the middle of the income distribution shared in that efficiency through higher real wages, and the cost of housing, healthcare, and education remained broadly proportional to those wages. That relationship broke down starting in the late 1970s and has continued to diverge ever since. Productivity has kept rising. Wages for the middle of the distribution have grown slowly, and the costs of the 3 things that most define middle-class life, housing, healthcare, and education, have grown dramatically faster than either. The result is a squeeze that is structural, not behavioral, and that no amount of personal financial discipline can fully resolve at the individual level. Understanding this does not mean accepting it as fixed or permanent, but it does change the nature of the response that makes sense. The households that manage to exit the middle-class trap consistently do so, not through dramatic single moves, but through a gradual and deliberate restructuring of where their money flows, prioritizing asset accumulation over lifestyle expansion, building enough liquidity to break the cycle of debt as emergency response, and treating the gap between income and spending not as money left over, but as the engine of future freedom. These are not novel insights. They appear in every serious treatment of household finance, but they are genuinely difficult to implement inside a system that is constantly generating pressure in the opposite direction. The middle-class trap is not a character flaw dressed up as economics. It is a